Hello, friends. Today we're going to talk about expansionism, and we're going to kick you off ready to go for Unit 3 on westward expansion and imperialism. And the very first thing that we need you to do as we jump into this unit is to really examine this sort of larger question about what is expansionism and how has it shaped our domestic and foreign policy. So I've posted here some maps to kind of even give you a sense of how the country has changed between the time of 1803 and 1863. And I think that visual is hopefully going to help you frame how we think about this topic. The first thing that we need to talk about when we talk about expansionism is a concept called manifest destiny. And you may remember this idea of manifest destiny from your U.S. History 1 class. But we want to make sure that we revisit it because it's kind of an important one. Manifest destiny is this belief that the United States has a God-given mission to spread power and civilization across North America. So it's sort of this philosophy that it is a religious need. And I think that's the concept here. It's God-given, it is religious. So it's got that connotation associated with it, that it comes from above, that there has to be a directive to do, to spread our power and spread civilization. And the idea is that influence would happen from coast to coast, right? From the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. And with that in mind, and thinking that it is a God-given mission, think about what a mission is, what that means, right? It means that you're implored to do something. You have to take action. So manifest destiny is an empowered term that requires action for the people living in the early 1800s. And we see some examples of that. Although the language might not be used at the time, certainly the philosophy behind it is there. And so we've identified this application of the concept here. In 1803, the core of discovery sets out, and we'll keep that in mind, that's what we typically call like Lewis and Clark, right? But there's more than just Lewis and Clark in this group. They get a lot of recognition, but there is a lot of people with them. So we want to talk about them as sort of being a group, the core of discovery. They set out after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. They head out, actually technically 1804. It come out into our own region, in fact. And the point of doing that is to explore and to map out the West. Why? Because it is the mission of the country to do so. It's that idea that they're implored to do it. They must take action. In the 1810s, really through the early 1820s, we see this next wave of people, the explorers and the mountain men, again coming out to engage and see what the West is like, and to map it out so that others can come out later, which is the third wave. That's in the 1820s, the religious missionaries, really tying into this concept of manifest destiny, that it is their God-given mission to spread power and civilization, right? This idea that it is the mission of the missionaries to share religious values and to encourage tribes to consider shifting religious understandings or figuring out how to mesh them together. And so we see that in the 1820s. From the 1830s through really the 1860s, we see the overland trails, and that's the broad term we give to people who head out on the Oregon Trail. But there's more than the Oregon Trail. There's the California Trail. There's the Santa Fe Trail. So we lump them together and call them the Overland Trail, right? That's when we see families kind of emerge out to the West, and their intention is true settlement, to take the land, to live on the land, and to be, establishing a sense of the United States in these Western regions. Again, it's part of this concept of manifest destiny, having a mission, establishing a sense of a civilization and power. In 1862, actually in the middle of the Civil War, the Homestead Act is created by Congress. And the Homestead Act basically said, listen, if you want to, you can head out west, stake a claim. It's 160 acres. You have to live on the land for 5 years. If you can last for 5 years on your 160 acres, that land is yours for free. That was the United States government way of encouraging settlement out west, and also sort of releasing some of the pressure that was emerging in some of these urban areas at the time for 1862 of places like New York City. So the Homestead Act really kind of largely pushes people to start moving out west. We do need to address Turner's frontier thesis. And we talk about Turner's frontier thesis as a way of helping us understand how people think about the West and what the West is to in relation to the East. So let me identify, first of all, what's meant by thesis. So Frederick Jackson Turner is a history major, right? Much like myself, much like Ms. Kiefer. And so he went and got a PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And when you seek a master's degree or PhD, you have to write a very large paper. I wrote a paper, it was 136 pages in order to get my master's degree. And it was a thesis, right? I wrote on a topic. Well, Frederick Jackson Turner does the exact same thing, right? He writes a thesis, he writes this paper, and he makes an argument, right? That's what you do in your big paper in history grad school, is you're making an argument. And what he argues is that the frontier, what you think of as the American West, is settled. Right, it's filled in. There's no real free land left, and as a result, manifest destiny has come to fruition. It's happened. Right, we have created power and civilization throughout the country. We've settled it. We've stabilized it, and there's a second part to it, and that is, well, now that the frontier is gone, there's no land left. There's a concern that maybe the United States will become overcrowded, right? If there's no excess land for people to go to as they move into eastern cities or immigrate into the country, because this is at the exact same time as what we were talking about in the previous unit, then where will people go to? Oh my gosh, will we be crowded? Will all of America look like the big cities? And that creates a little bit of a panic or a sense of, maybe the country needs to consider expanding outside the borders of what you know as the United States. So that takes us to kind of a pause. And we've talked a little bit about this concept now of manifest destiny and how it implores folks to settle, implores the country to expand across from coast to coast. And now Turner's frontier thesis, which essentially says that, hey, the country's filled in, manifest destiny has been met, it's happened, and it's done. But as I left you with that concept of, well, then maybe do we need to expand outside the borders of the United States in order to alleviate the stress of the cities, in order to alleviate the pressure of the populations that are moving in? We will now switch gears and talk a little bit about seeking overseas, seeking international engagement, and starting to expand outside the borders of the United States. So let's back up a little bit. And again, I'm going to refer back to something hopefully you talked about in your U.S. history class last year, and that's the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine is created in 1823 by President Monroe. And it asserts, as you can see on the slide, that North and South America are off limits to European colonization and interference. And I love this phrase. Ms. Kiefer made this slide, and it says, "You stay on your side and we'll stay on ours." It really is that philosophy of, hey, Europe, don't engage in North and South America. It's like there's a line in the sand almost. And if you don't cross this line, we won't mess with your business. You don't mess with whatever happens over here. And, this bullet point of any attempts by Europe to intervene in the Western Hemisphere are seen as aggression. Now, I want you to stop and think about that. What if we draw this line in the sand and say, okay, Europe, you can't intervene over here on this other line or this other side. But what if European countries have colonies on that other side? What are they supposed to do? Are they not allowed to engage in those colonies that are in the Western Hemisphere or in South America? Like if you're Spain, you own Colombia, you own Venezuela. If you're Portugal, you own Brazil. Like, are you not allowed to engage in the land that is actually part of your empire? This is a good question. Now, in 1823, this question is an interesting one, and it is one in which the U.S. is not readily able to answer. And part of that is because there's no way to respond to what if Europe decides to intervene in their own colonies, right? If Spain wants to engage in Cuba, which was one of their colonies, if they do after 1823, like, what's the consequence for doing so? Is the United States going to like raise an army and go beat up on Spain in 1823? This is a good question. And quite frankly, I should tell you, in 1823, the United States did not have a standing military. For most of our history, we haven't had a standing military. And by standing military, I mean like what you see today, where you have a permanent military that you can place at any given time, right? When we needed a military, really prior to World War I and World War II, we had to draft. We didn't keep a standing military. That's why we had drafts historically, you guys. It's not because we needed lots more. It's that we didn't really have a military. So there's really no way in 1823 for the United States to be able to fight Spain. We didn't have a military to do so. But nonetheless, this is on the books, right? It's not heavily enforceable. And I think that's the takeaway I want you to get from this, is that the Monroe Doctrine is not heavily enforceable at the time. We're going to add to this. We've talked about manifest destiny. We now understand the Monroe Doctrine. We're going to add to this sort of this prevailing philosophy that emerges. So starting kind of in the second half of the 1800s, there's a belief system called social Darwinism. And in social Darwinism, if you guys are familiar with Charles Darwin and theory of evolution, and there's this phrase called survival of the fittest, right? Like we think about that in terms of organisms and, I mean, even viruses, right? A variety of these things of survival of the fittest. The strongest survive, the weakest are pulled back. And social Darwinism kind of applies in the same way. The belief system is that there is a hierarchy of people that are social Darwinists believe that some people are better than other people. It applies in lots of contexts, but there's this philosophy that if you are someone who is at the top of the social hierarchy, you have a burden. And we call that the white man's burden. So it should give you an indication already of who perceives who's got power in this social hierarchy. The phrase "the white man's burden" does come from a poem by Rudyard Kipling, but the philosophy is it asserts that whites are morally responsible to civilize non-white people. So come back to my concept of the social hierarchy that emerges in social Darwinism and white man's burden, and that's the belief system that whites were inherently more powerful and were more fit to survive. And the white man's burden then implores, right, requires that whites are required to civilize non-white people. And I think it's important to highlight that means that in this philosophy at the time, that one population's values are more important or a higher priority than others. So under the white man's burden, the thinking is that whites were going to civilize non-whites and that they needed to encourage their progress, both economic, social, and cultural, through colonization. Therefore, the white man's burden in social Darwinism really encouraged that whites would go and expand into areas that historically were not white, with the intent of civilizing the people who were there. Now, I think it's important, and the reason why I quoted the phrase like civilized, and because that's also a cultural value. Like what you think is civilized versus what I think is civilized might be two different things, right? You might say it is uncivilized for somebody who does not have an Alexa to turn on their lights in their house, right? And if you don't have an Alexa, you're uncivilized. So that it's a relative value. It just depends on what you perceive. There's not sort of a universal definition of what it means to be civilized versus uncivilized. But I think that's the point. And so under social Darwinism, it's pushing on a social value onto some other person or some other group of people. And really, we oftentimes say that this justifies this idea that the United States should take hold of and control these territories and cultures. So I hope that you understand, you're walking away from today's discussion that these are reasons that are given for expanding, right? This is the philosophy involved in why the United States should go from coast to coast, right? As we think of manifest destiny, and why the United States should consider expanding into other areas because it is a responsibility to do so, right? To encourage progress and to share value systems. So we'll stop on that note. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of background as we move into the rest of this unit. It's a short one, but there's a lot of material that we're going to go through. So we'll talk at you later. Bye.